Welcome everyone. It's my privilege to be starting off the distinguished speaker series of Vayu, which if you don't know what Vayu means, it's Vivekananda Yoga University. It's an acronym. It also refers to a fundamental concept in yoga, which is the internal energy, which is harnessed through the breath. And the name for breath in Sanskrit is Vayu. So it's a bit of a play on words on our part. Today's topic is history and lineage of yoga. So I'll be telling you how old yoga is and how it has evolved over the years. But one thing to keep in mind when you talk about yogic history is yoga is been continually practiced throughout its existence. However old it is, however hundreds or thousands of years old, there has always been every day during that period, somebody that got up in the morning and did yoga, and other people that got up in the morning and taught yoga. So it's a continuous tradition, unbroken, and we have a lot of historical evidence for this. Secondly, it's a continuous practice, meaning there are three words that are used in Sanskrit. One is called anusthana. Anusthana means practice. Next is dhyana, which means study. And the third one is anubhava, experience. So yoga is about study. It is about dhyana for sure, but it is about practice. And therefore, there have been over the period of yoga's existence, hundreds of thousands of teachers, each of whom have slightly modified yoga according to their own inspiration. So traditions, schools, expressions have come and gone, hundreds of them, thousands of them, we don't know. And when we look at yoga as snapshots in time through older textbooks, we only get a glimpse of some of those traditions. So the lineage, meaning who taught yoga, and the history, where yoga comes from, they are inseparable. So history and lineage are itihasa and parampara in Sanskrit. They are both equally important. So I'll go over that one. Now, another point I want to make is we don't learn history. That's a little bit pointless. We learn from history. That is far more to the point. So you have to ask yourselves the question. So maybe you went to a yoga class today or sometime this week. I taught yoga this morning myself, and I'll teach it tomorrow morning. When you went to class, maybe you took your yoga mat, you did trikonasana, triangle pose, maybe sarvangasana, shoulder stand, maybe shavasana, deep relaxation, and so on. If you went to a yoga class in an ashram in India, among the Himalayas 500 years ago, would you do the same thing that you did in your yoga class today here in, say, California or New Jersey or Bangalore or Delhi? Maybe, maybe not. We'll talk about that. I'll spend some time talking about that. Learning from history, it's important. The second is what you do today better, worse, or better and worse than what they used to teach you 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago? Again, we'll attempt to answer those questions. We have to be students of history to learn from it. So without more of an introduction, let me start. I will share my screen. I'll be coming in and out of PowerPoint. I see 92 participants. Those of you I haven't had a chance to welcome specifically, please welcome. It's wonderful to have you all here. So let me start. History and lineage of yoga. First, when you ask how old yoga is, there are many contrary viewpoints, okay? In fact, you will get three different answers. How old is yoga? Yogic historians, yogic history is a fairly recent topic of interest. I don't know how many people are you studying yogic history. I'm certainly one of the researchers looking at it, and there's probably 50 to 100 of us across the world, no more. And depending on whom you ask, all of these scholars will give you one of three answers. The first answer that's given is yoga is as ancient as humanity. It has always existed because it's endemic to human condition. Its origins are lost in the mists of antiquity. That's one viewpoint. The second viewpoint says yoga emerged in the Middle Ages. It was practiced by renunciants, mendicants, sadhus, Caitians, Naths, and so on, and it was cultish in nature. That's the second answer you get. The third answer you get is yoga emerged in the 19th century, and it was influenced by the Vyayama tradition, the exercise tradition of India, and European calisthenic practices. So these are three different answers. Each of these there is a lot of scholarship, a lot of sincerity behind this, and they have done extraordinary research to support this. But only one of them can be true. Which is correct? In order to know that, we have to ask a different question. We have to say, what is yoga? It's only by answering what is yoga, you can answer how old yoga is. Otherwise, how can you answer it? If you only by saying what is Indian cuisine, you can say how healthy is Indian cuisine, right? So let's look at what's yoga. Again, not surprisingly, we get three answers. This time I'll go bottom up. So start looking from bottom. The first answer says, yoga is a physical practice meant to bestow physical health, mental well-being. It's going to make your liver work better, improve your immune system, help you sleep better, anxiety, depression, all of that. It's a physical health and mental well-being. The second answer says yoga is an esoteric practice. The word esoteric applies to anything that says that the reality that we see is only a small part of the actual reality. There is a hidden reality, not seen or sensed. All esoteric, it's the esoteric Sufi tradition in India and Iran, esoteric Kabbalistic tradition as an offshoot of Judaism. All of them talk about this deeper essence that lies beyond the physicality of who we are. And so a second viewpoint says yoga is an esoteric practice meant to unlock human potential. So they talk about siddhis, the ability to be perfectly healthy, the ability to forever stay youthful, the ability to become small, become big, all of that, these semi-magical tradition that has sprung up around yoga. So they say it's an esoteric practice. The third answer, so it's meant to unlock human potential. The third answer says yoga is a spiritual practice. It is meant to calm the mind, make us less reactive, yoga's chitta vritti nirodh, as Patanjali said, calm down the waves of feeling, help us get into such deep states of stillness that while pain, which is endemic to the human condition, will happen, we don't have to suffer from it. So the third viewpoint says yoga is a spiritual practice meant to transcend the human condition of pain and suffering. Again, which is it? Now, when you line up what is yoga with how old is yoga, this is what you see. Researchers that approach yoga as a spiritual practice, they say that yoga is ancient. Researchers that approach yoga as an esoteric practice having to do with prana and nauli and the bandhas and detoxification, eternal youth, siddhis and so on, they say yoga is about 1,000 years old. People that approach yoga as a physical practice of asanas, they say yoga is about 200 years old. Now, this is where we have to step back as researchers, as historians. What we have to recognize is yoga is all three. There is a very famous observation about yoga, that yoga is like an ocean. If you go to the ocean with a small cup, then you can get a cup full of water. If you go to the ocean with a big bucket, then you get a big bucket of water. But instead, if you go jump into the ocean, then the entire ocean becomes yours. So it's the same here, that if you ask yogic practices, if you set as an outcome that I want to improve my health, then that's what you will get. If you ask yogic practices to say, I want to unlock my hidden potential, then that's what you'll get. If you go to yogic practices and say, I want to ask the big questions, I want to solve the big problems of life, transcend pain and suffering, then that's what you'll get. So yoga is, in a very real sense, all three. And as historians, when we say how old is yoga, we have to take all three into account. Okay, so with that, let me dive a little bit deeper into yogic history. Like any history, if you look at history of Western civilization, you can say there is a prehistory. This was before Greeks. We didn't know what happened. Then there is a classical period in Western civilization, that's Greeks and Romans. And then there is a intermediate dark ages. And then there is a modern history. Yoga is very similar. It has a prehistory, it has a classical history where we know a lot, and there is an intermediate period where nothing is clear. And then there is the modern age. I'll trace it to you step by step. It's very, very interesting. The prehistory of yoga, lost in the mists of time. We really don't know how old it is, but I'll give you a sense of the evidence that we have. Take a look. First, the historical evidence, meaning what we can touch and feel. Within the Indus Valley civilization, these days some people also call it the Saraswati Sindhu civilization. I don't want to get into that controversy. Let me just say Indus Valley. There was a seal that was found. I have put here the photograph of that seal. It's sometimes called Proto-Shiva seal. It's sometimes called the Pashupati seal. But if you look at this person in the bottom of the photo sitting, that is what would be called Bhadrasana. The heels of that person is pressed into the perineum, and he is sitting in what would be a cross-legged pose with the spine straight, chin parallel to the floor, eyes closed, and gaze uplifted. It's a classic meditative posture of Hatha yoga. So, and there are other evidence too, but we know from this seal is dated to be around 4,300 to 4,000 years old, somewhere in that range. So we know that yoga is at least that old. Now, Rig Veda has, within the 10th book, it says book number 1, forgive me, it has to say book number 10. They're called mandalas, 10th book, and it is Sukta number 136. It's called Keshin. Keshin means hair. The Keshin Sukta has a remarkably yogic feeling to it. It says, Vayu has churned for him, for he pounded things most hard to bend. So it's talking about powers for one that knows how to control the inner energy. You should read the entire sukta. It has 7 hymns or riks or shlokas. They're in Anushtuk for those of you that know about such things. And it's remarkably yogic. And Rig Veda is no later than 3,500 years ago. Depending on whom you ask, it is much, much earlier. Again, I don't want to get into that controversy here. I'm just presenting a broad academic viewpoint. Kathopanishad, there are within the canon of Sanatana Dharma, from which Hinduism is an offshoot. Within the canon of that ancient practice, Rig Veda is the oldest book. Kathopanishad is probably the 3rd oldest. Katha Upanishad. Upanishad is it's called Vedanta. It's the appendix to the Vedas. This is probably the 3rd oldest book. And in it, it's written, this firm holding back of the senses is what is known as the yoga. It talks about yoga as sensory withdrawal, or pratyahara, as it's called in the Yoga Sutras. Shvetashvatara Upanishad, that's in the 4th set of yogic texts. Vedanta again, and it talks here again about a meditative posture. So this is, again, all of these easily takes yoga back to between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. And there is much more evidence. We'll soon in Vayu, we'll have a course on historical studies in yoga, but I wanted to give you a sense of where yogic prehistory comes from. Okay. Now, in historical times, meaning this is classic yoga, we have 2 major sources. One is the famous Bhagavad Gita. Those of you that are not familiar with it, it's often referred to as the Bible of India. It's beloved, it's inspired. Thousands of people across thousands of years, it's still studied everywhere in the world. Again, we don't know how old it is. The most conservative date is that it's 2,700 years old. The more accepted date that is that it's closer to 5,000 years old. Nonetheless, we have Bhagavad Gita and then the Yoga Sutras. That's the textbook of yoga. The Bhagavad Gita talks about basically it's about enlightenment, or jnanodaya as it is called. It says that you can use your body and work selflessly. That is a kind of yoga. You can use your intellect, jnana, and you can use that to purify your heart. That is yoga. You can directly purify your heart through devotion to something higher than you. That is yoga too. And it talks about Raja Yoga. It says, work with your breath. Work the apana current, meaning the downward exhaling breath, and the prana current, the inhaling breath. Join them together. That is yoga too. So this is very well documented. Then we have Yoga Sutras, probably the most important text on yoga. Sutra means aphorism. It's a very pithy, think of it as a mathematical formula. If you look at a formula such as E equals mc squared, and if you are a physicist, that one single formula will tell you enough, which would have taken 300 pages to write down. Yoga Sutras are like that. They are very, very compact formulas. For yoga asanas, it stays sthira sukham asanam. And within that formula is contained many hints for how to practice yoga. But nonetheless, it is a science of the mind. It talks about moksha, liberation. It talks about the technique of moksha, which is Ashtanga Yoga. It talks about the description. It's called Kaivalya. It talks about a state of superconsciousness called Samadhi. Nature of God called Ishvara. Cause of suffering called Klesha. Signs of spiritual progress called Siddhis. Obstacles to practice called Antaraya. All of these are part of the textbook of Raja Yoga. Wonderful. Again, we'll study that quite a bit in Vayu. In fact, almost any yoga program, there are many in the United States, they all study Yoga Sutras. It's the seminal central text. Now, then comes a mysterious time from Patanjali's time, that is Yoga Sutras, until about 500 AD. We don't really know what happened. There are many indications that yoga was practiced, but there isn't any documentary evidence. We know a little bit. For example, when Alexander the Great came to India, there is evidence that he met a yogi named Dandamas. Dandamas is his Greek name, Hellenistic name. We don't know what his Indian name is. But he was inspired enough by the yogi that when he went back to Babylon, Dandamas went back with Alexander the Great. Not with, there's some miraculous story. It's very interesting. I don't have time to say it. But nonetheless, we find things, evidence, but there is no books in this period. Then something interesting happens. Around 500 AD, what we call as Hatha Yoga suddenly comes, fully formed. It doesn't evolve. It's like the pyramids of Egypt. One day it's not there, next day it's suddenly there. It's that kind of abrupt transition. And it is credited to a yogi named Matsyendranath. And Ardha Matsyendrasana, for those of you that practice yoga, it's named after him. He belonged to a group that called itself as the Naths. Nath means Lord, so presumably they were devotees of Shiva, Maheshwara. And they practiced a form of yoga that is recognizable today. You could go into a yoga studio and chances are you'd be practicing some of those. So it has a direct link to the present. They did purification techniques, they did asanas, pranayamas. I'll tell you more about it. They also practiced extreme austerities, meaning extreme self-denial, even to the extent of not even wearing clothes. You will see descendants of Matsyendranath even today during every Kumbh Mela, the great gathering that just finished in India right now. These Nath sadhus, they're called Naga sadhus. There is a descendant of one of the many branches. They exist even today, but it all started, historically speaking, around 500 AD. And then in the next 1300 years, so many textbooks on Hatha Yoga were found. They are all written in Sanskrit. And you have, just to give you some names, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Gheranda Samhita, Goraksha Samhita, Shiva Samhita, and on and on. And some of these were very advanced. There's a small book called Yoga Yajnavalkya, and it's not right here on my bookshelf, otherwise I would have shown you. It's an entire book that deals with what we today call as Anuloma Viloma Pranayama, Nadi Shodhana Pranayama, an entire book, very wonderfully written. Amanaska Yoga talks about a technique that's practiced all over among yogis today. It's called Ajapa Japa or Hong Sa. It's a technique that Yogananda formalized. Amanaska Yoga talks about that. Again, Kechari Vidya, it's a very big book. It's dedicated to a very advanced yoga technique called Kechari Mudra. Kumbhaka Paddhati talks about 70 different pranayama techniques and on and on. So there is an extraordinary library of books that are available, but they're all esoteric. They're all about awakening an inner power that is not visible to the senses. So it talks about doing one yoga pose and not having any diseases whatsoever, things like that. So from prehistory to classical to this intermediate period, this is how yoga developed. Now we come to yoga in the modern times. What happened around 1850? But before I go there, it's been about 20 minutes. I've talked uninterruptedly, but let me break for a moment. I don't need to talk about this one. Okay, let me break for a moment. And let's just step back from the history of yoga. I want to tell you a little bit about Vayu. This is the institution which has sponsored these. You see, as it must have been obvious from what I said, if you want to understand where yoga comes from, you have to take a holistic view. If you say yoga is just asanas, it's a headstand, shoulder stand, triangle pose, then you will get the wrong answer of how old yoga is. In fact, you'll miss something. If you say yoga is very, very ancient and it was only practiced by Krishna and then that's how we should practice, again, you'll miss something. Or if you say, I am in yoga just to fly in the air and acquire esoteric powers, again, you'll miss something. Yoga has to be studied holistically. And our vision in Vayu, in Vivekananda Yoga University, was to provide an objective, scientific, academic space where anybody that's interested in yoga can study not some of yoga, but all of yoga. So when you come into Vayu, you will study all the three aspects that I just mentioned: Anushtana, practice; Adhyayana, theory; and Anubhava, experience. So at the end of our Master of Science, you will be able to teach yoga. You will, if you wish, for a little extra work, you will get a degree in yoga therapy. You will study all of these Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Sutras, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Gheranda Samhita. You will study all of those. It's required study. And you will also study science, how to conduct a yoga experiment. Let's not take what somebody wrote just because it was written 2,000 years ago. Let's verify it for ourselves. You will get the skills to conduct the experiment. You learn the mathematics. As Dr. Rajni was saying, I'll use it as a statistical parameter because she's a yogi and a statistician. And so we'll teach you all of that. And if any of this is remotely interesting to you, those of you that are attending this webinar and not yet students of Vayu, then certainly ask us questions at the end of this webinar. We'll all be more than happy to answer you. And also go to the website, look us up. All of us founders and including, in fact, most especially Mr. Babubhai Gandhi and Mr. Chakrapani, we've all dedicated decades of our lives to looking at yoga in an objective way. And so we are in it because of the passion. And so hopefully you'll get inspired by it too. So that's my little commercial for Vayu. So let's just for 30 seconds, go get yourself a glass of water. I'll do the same, do a little bit of a stretch, and we'll gather back in exactly 30 seconds. And then I'll tell you some very fascinating things.